Hello, welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and I'm happy to be back with these live streams after a long hiatus. And I'm delighted that you are here with me. So, today is a solemn day because it's the 20th anniversary of September 11 attacks. And we have also moved into a new phase in the region of Afghanistan with the fall of Afghanistan yet again to Taliban. And I found that to be a really, personally, a traumatic event in so many ways, but mostly as a public scholar and as someone who thinks about the world and, cares about the people who live in it. So my response to what has befallen Afghanistan is not guided by any national interest or interests of one or the other constituency. It's prompted by, my own humanistic solidarity with people of Afghanistan. And that's why as soon as I saw that Kabul was about to fall, I decided to share my views on the channel with all those who were interested in it. Now, in the process, I was also viewing and evaluating how different constituencies were responding to it. For example, how the Americans were responding to it, how the Pakistanis are responding to it, how India is responding to it. But what my attempt has been is to focus the thinking about Afghanistan on the people of Afghanistan and how will this development or this regression in a way impact their lives. So that's why I've stated my views publicly on this. So obviously I'm opposed to this new rise of Taliban, and I've elaborated my reasons for it before as well. But the reason I'm opposed to it is, first of all, it came about through violent means, right? There's a group of people who have conquered a country and now are forming a cabinet and want to be considered a legitimate government. Two, we have a history of Taliban and their actions right in front of us. We know what they are capable of. We know how the lives of women, minorities, and everyone else in Afghanistan will be curtailed, right? And so when we take sides, if for some reason we are siding with Taliban, that is what we are siding with. And that's what we need to keep in mind. Now, quite a few people send me private messages and they just assume that I am somehow naive. I am not really naive. I know the strategic interests of Pakistan and Afghanistan. I'm aware of Indian strategic interests in Afghanistan, also of the Chinese and Russians, right? Each one of these constituencies has their own axe to grind, have their own national interests. I refuse to see Afghanistan from their point of view, because I think what the people of Afghanistan deserve is our empathy, but also to view their plight in humanistic terms, right? And see how can we be in solidarity with them in this time of trial. So these are some of my thoughts, and of course, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. I'm already on record on this issue. Actually, I'll post the links to this after I'm done today. I've already done one interview with a German magazine about it. I've also published, some of my own thoughts on it. And of course, I have recorded videos on it as these things unfolded. So let's look at, let's say, regional interests. Pakistan, which is my country of birth, right? And also my native country. So there's a lot of jubilation in Pakistan in the public sphere, but also in private discussions and everything else. And it is understandable because Pakistanis saw the previous government as a government hostile to Pakistan. And now seeing Taliban, right, who are friendly to Pakistan, what they are seeing is that they now have an advantage against India in Afghanistan because they have a complacent regime, right? That is the reason for that jubilation. The more quixotic versions of it is this elation that somehow the Taliban have defeated America and hence, they are someone they can consider as heroes, right? These are some of the things coming out of Pakistan. In India, since India had invested heavily with the previous government, there is a lot of anger and fear, and some of their channels, which are affiliated with government propaganda, were trying to prop up Panjshir and everything else. So they are now reeling from their own engagement with the previous government. So these two countries, they see Afghanistan in instrumental terms, right? They see it as to how the people and the land of Afghanistan could be useful to their interest, right? I am not bound to do that, right? I have no reason to do that as a public intellectual. My job is to see how this development impacts the people of Afghanistan. And of course, it is going to impact them very negatively. And so I speak in solidarity with the people of Afghanistan. I had also recorded a video, especially addressed to my Pakistani audiences, because my point was that if they could look at what they are supporting critically and not emotionally, here is what they are supporting, right? They are supporting a militant regime. Some of them are still on the terroristic list. A regime that is known for oppressing women and for oppressing and killing minorities. And as we see the signs, they've already started to do that. So if Pakistanis support them officially or unofficially, that is what they are supporting. To Afghan people, there is no time to rationalize it and say, well, it's in Pakistan's interest. No. To Afghan people, if you are supporting the Taliban right now, and if you make it possible to stay in power, you are supporting a regime which is going to and is brutalizing the Afghan people, which is killing their own people, right? And that is how they will see it. And that is how they will view Pakistan's role in it. Okay. And that is something that the Pakistanis ought to think. But overall, as someone who works with constituencies who are not powerful and constituencies who deal with power, my place is pretty clear. I have to be with the people of Afghanistan. I have to speak with them, not for them, but in solidarity with them. And that's why, I chose today not as an educational topic, it's a deeply political topic. That's why I chose today, because I think we all need to have this heart-to-heart conversation about what has befallen Afghanistan. So, okay, I will wait for your questions, but let me welcome people. So we have Batul Rao. Thank you so much for joining us. Orako, welcome back. Hanan, welcome back. And Hanan has a point here. Let me bring it up. I would agree it is not about being naive. Thing is, using religious militancy to achieve ulterior motives is not how you run a government. A much better and peaceful solution could have been put forth. So yes, I agree, because, think of it. The Taliban have now formed a cabinet, which is all men and all from the Taliban. So they had promised that they will have an inclusive government. It's not an inclusive government. It has no women on it, as well as it has no non-Taliban, non-Pashtun people on it. And two, you don't just conquer a country and then form a government and say we want legitimacy. No, there are ways in which governments come to power. Now, as imperfect as it might have been what the Americans did in Afghanistan, in the last 20 years, they did introduce, a democratic system. If you disrupt that and then implement a system in which one group gains power because they have more guns, what is the precedence that we are setting? Is that what is going to be the system? More importantly, if we think in hypothetical terms, if a group of people with guns, let's say in Pakistan, there are quite a few movements fighting against the federal government and all. Let's say the Balochistan Liberation Army has enough power and enough guns to at least conquer Balochistan. Would you as a nation accept them as a legitimate government? Would you say that, oh yeah, they have conquered Balochistan, so it is there, right? So it doesn't make sense when Pakistani intellectuals and scholars turn around and say, oh, the Taliban have conquered Afghanistan, so it is rightfully theirs. That basically defies that principle of a nation being autonomous and electing its own people, right? So that's my point too. So, okay, Sajjad, thank you so much. You always say that. I think it's really interesting that you're from Kashmir. I have a lot of affiliation for Kashmir, but we are talking about the Afghan people today and what has befallen them. All right, so anyone else? Any other questions? No, I've had questions from my colleagues and friends and my detractors from Pakistan. And, they are trying to tell me that I should see their side of the story. But, as scholars, and this is something we learn from each other, is we always stake ourselves with a cause if you're a political scholar. And I have aligned myself with the people of Afghanistan. Now, some people would say the Taliban are also people of Afghanistan. Yes, they are, right? But if they come to power by the vote of the people, I'm fine with it, right? But if they come to power through the power of guns and then terrorize their own people, right, then to me, they can be as Afghan as they want, but they are not working with their own people. That's how I think about it. Okay, Anu. Sir, I'm asking this from the light of post-colonialism. Can we deconstruct the concept of nations so that the refugees will get tolerated than desegregating them? That's a really important question, and it applies, of course, strongly to people of Afghanistan. I don't know if we need to deconstruct the concept of the nation. I am, in my thought, I am post-nationalist, so I don't really believe in the stringent boundaries of, nations. I believe in planetarity. So for me, if Afghan people are in trouble, they should be able to move wherever they want and make a life for themselves. That's an idealistic belief. But I think regionally, at least what we can hope from the regional governments, and that is Iran and Pakistan, which are the adjacent territories to Afghanistan, that they will open their borders to anyone who wants to leave the Taliban regime. And so that they can recover and they can build their lives, right? And maybe someday return to Afghanistan. So thank you so much. Oroko, any material on the topic of Death of a Nation? So there is one book which is called Death of a Nation. It's by David Noble, and it is kind of a critique of American exceptionalism. But if you just do a search on post-nationalism, cosmopolitanism, there are a lot of scholars like Bruce Robbins, Feng Chia, quite a few others who have theorized, and they talk about either post-nationalism or cosmopolitanism. If you look through my playlists, I also have a few I think webinars, recorded webinars on cosmopolitanism, and in their description, you will see some of the books on cosmopolitanism and post-nationalism. Okay, good. So, but overall, it is good to be back, even though on a solemn day and about a sad topic. But, you know, that's what I've been talking about since the fall of Kabul, is why did I start talking about it? Because I think as a scholar, I felt it my responsibility to at least put it on record, right, as to where do I stand on it and why. And there is some importance to that, because if we stay quiet and we don't say anything about it, then the normalized narratives that are coming out of Pakistan, India, United States, then there is no challenge to them, right? And I think, puny as my efforts might be, I mean, you know, who am I? I have no power. But morally, as a public intellectual, I think it is my responsibility to state my point of view and to state it in solidarity with people of Afghanistan. So Sajjad, sorry I cannot answer that question today. Obviously, you know that today's topic is Afghanistan. If I went into Derrida right now, that would defeat the whole purpose of today's webinar. But I mean, if you read the preface carefully, you know what that sentence already means, right? All right. Anyone else? Okay. So beyond that, I just wanted to point out that I just did an interview which was published today in a German magazine, and I will post a link to the description of this webinar. And you can hear my views about US foreign policy, US policy in Afghanistan, and then my views on what has happened to Afghanistan. Well, I mean, is it wise to say that American war had ended with the demise of... Well, I mean, I was opposed to the invasion of Afghanistan when it was happening. And I had published on it too. And I was opposed to it because my point was that war is not the way to solve this problem. Policing maybe is, right? A more precise way of going about, you know, tackling what was then Al-Qaeda. So I don't know if that was the end. I mean, by the time Osama bin Laden is killed, he was already irrelevant, right? Because others had taken over. And right then, ISIS was already emerging from the ruins of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. The problem with wars or war on terror is that they become perpetual wars, right? Instead, I think the approach would be multifaceted, right? Part of what is happening in the world, the rise of these right-wing fundamentalist groups, is because the very global economy in which they exist, the number of people who are not included in the promise of the national and global economy is constantly increasing. The governments are being privatized, the functions of the government, so the private players who have money and guns can incorporate these people into their projects, right? So part of the solution has to be to reconfigure the global economy so that the disenfranchised people keep decreasing. And then an international cooperation in a way where different nations come together to fight the menace of terrorism, wherever it is, in whatever form. And the imperative on United States and others is to not rationalize their wars under one register and all, and not get manipulated into starting wars by their industries So all of these factors must be taken into account. But I don't think so. The so-called war on terror ended with the execution or death of Osama bin Laden. So any unbiased sources you would recommend to find out more about what is actually happening thereafter? Well, I mean, unbiased in a sense, you could go to like the website of National Public Radio, NPR, from United States. They tend to be pretty autonomous and they don't follow one or the other agenda. Then you can go to BBC pretty much does a good job. At least it's a professional job and it's not Euro or American centric. Then Democracy Now, if you go to their website, I'm pretty sure they have some very critical and if not unbiased, at least open discussions on Afghanistan. These are some of the sources that I would recommend. Okay, good question. Oroko, do you think that what happened to Afghanistan might recur in other nations? Yeah, I mean, it could. It could happen. The tragedy of Afghanistan is that, they have been under war-like conditions for 40 years, right? And so the civic structures are destroyed. The communities were just getting to a point where they were rebuilding themselves, right? And then there is presence of all these arms and weapons, and then the interests of the regional and global powers. It's happening in Africa right now, right? So you're seeing in the Tigray region and all, there's a civil war going on. It's happening in Yemen. So wherever, there are either regional or global interest, or wherever a majority is being minoritized, and since there are no democratic ways of resolving issues, so these instances are increasing. So I think, yes, my answer would be that this could happen elsewhere as well, and it is happening elsewhere. So Nimra, after pullout of allied forces from Afghanistan, can any implication be found on the Kashmir conflict in positive or negative manners? Well, the thing with Kashmir is, I am on record for suggesting that Kashmiris should be able to decide their own destiny. Okay. They neither belong to Pakistan nor to India. And when I say Kashmiris, I include the Kashmiri Pandits in it, right? Jammu and Kashmir. So the ideal solution for Kashmir is for Kashmir to decide what is it they want to do, not India, not Pakistan. So what the problem in the regional politics is that their slogan is Kashmir banega Pakistan, right? Kashmir will be Pakistan. I don't even think so. They've consulted all the Kashmiris about it. And India just annexed Kashmir. So it's a conflict since 1947. I don't know that if Afghanistan can teach us something about it or would prompt the regional powers to do something about it. But for me, my stance traditionally has always been that people of Kashmir autonomously as a people should be able to decide their own destiny without Pakistan or India involved in it. And maybe that would be a path towards, some kind of a resolution. But please keep in mind that my hope for the future is that India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and maybe Afghanistan will come together and form a confederacy where we don't have national armies or national borders. And if that's where we go, then Kashmir obviously becomes part of that larger, identity. But I think that's a pipe dream. But hey, if I'm thinking, why not think the impossible, right? Um, Good questions. So a little bit about the US failure in Afghanistan. My reading of it is, first of all, that they centralized the government too much. And then they didn't pay much attention to the corruption, the massive corruption that was happening. And even if they did pay attention to it, they tolerated it. They didn't read carefully how alienated the people were from the government, that from the elected government. And then I think leaving like that, without having a peacekeeping force, without having any firm commitments, I think that was irresponsible. And it wasn't needed. There was no pressure on the president of United States or everyone else to leave. There were no protests, right? Uh, so I do blame America for abandoning the Afghan people, right? And now, if you look at the statements of the Secretary of State and others, they're already talking about, oh, there is this other menace called ISIS-K, and we have to contain it. And the Taliban have promised with us that they will work against them. So they are creating this narrative of some kind of lukewarm acceptance of the Taliban regime, which I think is sad and, will legitimize this brutal regime. Okay, what else? Okay, Hanan. Another cause for the fall I heard from a teacher was that the Afghan soldiers literally refused to fight the Taliban, for their morale was so low due to delayed salaries and military corruption. Well, I mean, yeah, there are instances of that. After all, we know that if the Afghan army had fought the Taliban, they would have not succeeded uh, um, so clearly, so easily. But also keep in mind that we saw this in Iraq. When ISIS invaded in the beginning, the Iraqi army collapsed, right? Mosul fell like in one day. And the reason was that there was internal corruption, there was absenteeism, people were not motivated to fight, but then they were able to reconfigure themselves and eventually fight back, right? So, yeah, low morale was one of the reasons. I think another reason was that there wasn't enough time to develop a national force. You can't build a national force with national loyalties in 20 years. And the command was too centralized. So had they gone with regional divisions, regional deployments, people who had a stake in the community that they were defending, maybe that would have probably, and this is all like thinking in hindsight, this might have worked better. But there is no denying the fact that the leadership of the Afghan army wasn't committed enough or good enough. And the soldiers, they might have had the training and equipment, but they did not have any emotional commitment in protecting the areas where they were deployed. So, yeah, that's absolutely what I keep in mind. So this is Nimra. USA has confiscated 9.5 billions of the Afghan bank. Isn't another addition in the list of human rights violation? Well, I mean, that is the tragedy. I mean, okay, so what is the conundrum for the Western powers right now, right? Is do they bankrupt the Afghan Taliban government? And if they do so, there'll be great suffering, right? After all, who will suffer? The people. So right now, the humanitarian aid groups are figuring out a way to work with Taliban because their mission is to get food to the people. Now, can the Taliban be ousted simply by economic pressure? I don't think so. I mean, when you apply economic pressure on a regime like this, what is it that you are hoping? That their government would collapse and their own people will rise against them, right? That takes Afghanistan to another civil war, right? So I don't think so. These are light decisions on the parts of any powers, regional or unless like you are a power that is committed to Taliban and that's all you see, right? You have instrumentalized the Afghan people, and what you see is these are our people, they are in power, we don't care what happens to people of Afghanistan, we will legitimize them and work through them. If that is what in the real politic is what a nation thinks, it is tragic, it is sad, right? And it doesn't serve the purpose of the Afghan people. My reading of it is that Taliban already know that this is a different nation that they have encountered, right? Last time, I don't know how young you all are, when Taliban came to power, no one dared in the cities to even raise a voice. Yeah, the militias were fighting against them, but not in the cities. Now we are seeing these small instances of protests by women, by minorities. Now these people are doing that at great risk to themselves and their families. But if that is happening, it may be very small, it might be put down, the people might not come out tomorrow. That's something new, okay? And it's new. And it also teaches us that some civic sense of rights, of equality, has been instilled in young people, in women over the last 20 years, right? And they are putting their bodies at risk to ask for those rights. That is something that Taliban have not tackled before. They don't know how to tackle it. They don't know how to tackle a free press. They don't know how to tackle people with cellular phones who can record what they are doing. These technologies were not available when they came to power previously. I mean, they became available elsewhere, but not in Afghanistan. This is a new world, right? And we'll see what it brings about. So, Razi, I think I already kind of talked about, obviously, I have no solutions, right? But I think a way forward would be, I think one compromise that could be made with the Taliban is that, okay, you have established peace. Now, declare yourself an interim government and then figure out a way of how the transition of power will happen, how elections will be held, and see where it goes. I think that could be one way forward. If the popular resistance emerges non-military, non-violent, and then of course the international community should monitor that and make sure that people are not put down, they are not hurt, right? All of these are ways of dealing with Taliban. In the end, they have to run a country. It's a modern country with a banking system, with internet, with schools, with hospitals, right? They can't just run it with guns. Okay, a society, in order to sustain itself, must also reproduce itself. What that means is that it must produce the expertise that it needs. It must produce the teachers, the workers, the technicians, right? We are long past the stage where a country can just be governed simply because you promise that you will implement a religious ideology. That religious ideology at the end of the day must also deliver in material terms, right? And Taliban alone cannot deliver that, right? They are part of this world. The only way they can sustain this is if the regional powers, keep propping them up and if the people are kept subdued. But how long will you keep a people subdued like that? That's the question. So here I have Oroco. From today's discussion, I see a number of parallels between USA and the 19th and 20th century British monarchy. Yeah, even the monarchy before that, right? The way it functioned. In 19th and 20th century British monarchy kind of had become constitutional, right? But they had a lot of symbolic influence. United States has a lot of material influence in the world, but also symbolic power in the world. Now, keep in mind that there are also now mechanisms in place post September 11, 2001, that make it almost impossible for countries to openly support Taliban if they perform certain terroristic actions. So there is FATF, right? FATF. So Pakistan might be very eager to support Taliban for their own national interests. But if the Talibans have, known wanted terrorists in their cabinet, like Sirajuddin Haqqani, then it becomes difficult to openly support the Taliban, even for Pakistan, right? So there are mechanisms available to curtail the power of Taliban internationally. And also keep in mind, this is what the narrative was when the first time they came into power. Okay, the Taliban, when they emerged in the 90s, they swung from the south all the way to Kabul because none of the Pashtun warlords fought them. Okay, that's how they had reached there, right? This time, if you look at the campaign, it was a very well planned campaign. Someone who knows warfare planned it, because they didn't start from the south, which were their sympathetic territories. They started from the north, right? So they first fought off the territories that were likely to be hostile to them, right? And then came towards the south. So this was a very well planned campaign. But this time also they were fighting a nation, which is already exhausted and all that. But overall, I don't know what my point was. And what I see it as is that, yeah, they might have come into power, but it is a different group of people. It's a different nation. Maybe this time there will be no civil war. Maybe there will be civil action, right? Maybe people will mobilize. What do you think they are going to do if 100,000 or 200,000 people march into the streets of Kabul? I mean, are they going to shoot all of them? Obviously, no. Because the problem with politics of fear is it works only when you can terrify large groups of people. If your fear doesn't work on people, what are you going to do, right? So that's the conundrum that the Taliban are facing right now. So what can and should Pakistan do? Well, I mean, it's up to Pakistan to do whatever it wants to do. But my point is that calculate in cold, rational terms as to if you are supporting the Taliban tacitly or openly. Remember, Afghan people 30, 40 years from now, when they are free of Taliban, will remember you as a power that supported their oppressors. There is no denying the possibility of that fact. Okay, that is what you're doing. Now, the Taliban might suit Pakistani national interest right now. They might have been able to eliminate Indian national interest in that area. But that game between India and Pakistan was always at the cost of Afghan people. But right now, increase your humanitarian aid as Pakistan, open your borders to anyone who wants to come out, because they are escaping an atrocious regime, and stop any material or symbolic support to Taliban, right? And then lay down your conditions. What is wrong with laying down the condition and saying, we give you 2 years, right? Write down a constitution, ratify a constitution, figure out a mechanism of transfer of power or elections. Why would Pakistan want a democracy for itself and an autocratic emirate for Afghanistan? Why would it support that? Now, I know that they have to deal with Saudis and others, but those are already established nations. Pakistan has no power over their political system, but Pakistan has the choice to decide if they are going to support the Taliban? Would it just be that keep Indians out and we will support you, right? Or would it be, no, we will not support you if you brutalize your own people, if you murder, maim, and kill your own people, because that is not in the best interest of Pakistan. I think that is what Pakistanis should be thinking. That's what their intellectuals and so-called defense experts should be thinking. That's what should be on their mind, that the immediate gains come and go. The long-term implications of how you treat your neighbors, how you deal with them, are more important. Okay, is it true to assume that US has been falling as a nation, as US president called China, especially at the event of 20 years? I don't know if they are falling, but I mean, their influence is diminished, and part of it is because there are powers rising in the world, right? China is becoming a global player. Russian economy has stabilized. India is emerging as a regional and global power. So the United States has to share their power with certain other powers. On the other hand, I mean, facts are facts. Okay. United States still is the largest and the most innovative economy in the world. It has the largest base of scientists and people working and innovating in the world, right? And it has the most powerful military force in the world. Those are facts, right? Now, does that mean that they can take on Russia and China and start a world war? No. But so the waning of America is more about internal to United States, how the politics of United States is so polarized, how there is a constituency now on the extreme right, which is so far removed from truth, which is hateful, right? And terrified of differences. That is where America is becoming weaker, right? Internally, the politics is becoming more and more intolerant and polarized on the right. But that is a phenomena that's happening everywhere. Rise of the right? You see it in United States, you see it in India, you see it in Pakistan. So that's not something just particular to America. Okay, Razi, don't you think a very extreme ideology governing a neighborhood will hurt Pakistan? Maybe more extreme ideology may come forward and get some popularity in Pakistan. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And especially if it's an extreme ideology that has the tacit or open support from Pakistan. Look, when you get involved with jihadi movements elsewhere, they come to visit you one day, because what you have done is, symbolically speaking, you have made it permissible for people to have that kind of ideology, right? To consider it proper and maybe deeply religious. So if a government openly supports a group known for its brutality, known for its terrible views of human life and world, there is no way they can close their border to that ideology traveling back to their own land, especially if there are people already sympathetic to that kind of group. So it goes without saying that supporting these kind of politics and these kind of ideologies has a blowback effect. Pakistan has seen it previously. After all, Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, where did it come from? I mean, from the same people, right? So absolutely, it will have an impact on Pakistan. So it may look foolish to you, but I wanted to know, why did the US withdraw all of a sudden? Well, I mean, it wasn't all of a sudden. I think it was not planned well. So the Trump administration was the one which wanted to make it an election issue, right? So the Trump said, I want to pull Americans out of Afghanistan, because his rhetoric was America first, and there is no reason for us to be in Afghanistan and get our people killed. That was his logic, right? So our hope was that when Biden gets elected, he will delay the process until there is a peace deal, until the Taliban concede that, okay, there will be power sharing or whatever. Because there was no political imperative on Biden to pull out immediately, right? But the deadline had already been set, right? And so I don't know. I think sometimes we get caught in like this inexorable move of history. I mean, he has given very strong statements that it was time. And I think there was a misreading as well, a misreading by their strategists and by the generals about the capabilities of Afghan army, right? Maybe they thought that the Afghan army will be able to withstand the Taliban, right? But they probably had not even imagined that majority of the Afghan soldiers will not even fight, right? So all of these things kind of precipitated the situation and made it worse. But I mean, we can never really know what one reason or one cause was. That's why, like, I'm more focused um, on just defining our own stances. Look, you, me, and everyone else, we have no power, right? We can't tell our governments to do something. I mean, other than just our puny voices. What I'm trying to encourage is to think in humanistic terms, right, about Afghanistan. It doesn't matter where you are from, because we need to train ourselves to think in terms of what is, not in terms of what is in my national interest or what my leaders are telling me, but what is in the interest of the people whose lives are being impacted. And those are the people of Afghanistan, right? So, as a scholar, unless I'm a foundational scholar, which means if I've already sold my expertise to the highest bidder, I would rather stake my claim and make my space with the people of Afghanistan, with the women of Afghanistan, with the minorities in Afghanistan, right? And maybe symbolically, that's the most we can do, right? And that is all that I'm encouraging people from Pakistan to think about, people from India, people from United States. And beyond that, I'm pretty hopeful that people of Afghanistan will, eventually decide their own destiny. How long will it take them? How much help will they need is beyond my imagination. But I have never lost faith in Afghan people, right? So, Gota, any recommendations on what books one can read to know more about Afghanistan and its problems? Absolutely. What I'll do is when I post the link to the edited version of this webinar, I will make sure to create a list of some of the books that I like and I recommend, and I'll post it in the description. And that way you will have the whole list. I'll make sure to do that. Okay, anything else? We have been going on for about 48 minutes. So let me say I'm delighted to be back, and I'll try to continue doing this regularly. Obviously, not all of them will be on political topics like this. Most of these webinars tend to be on educational topics. But, there is a community tab on the channel. Feel free to send me any suggestions. Feel free to post any questions there so that I can think about them and incorporate it in the future planning. And as always, I'm really grateful and thankful that so many of you take the time to join me. As I've repeatedly said in my webinars and videos, this is no altruistic venture. Doing this and having your questions and exchanging views with you all is deeply, deeply gratifying to me personally. And it gives me a lot of energy and a lot of positive vibes from all of you. So I'm really grateful that you all take the time to join me. And so overall, I'm going to conclude, right? So what I'm encouraging to do uh, is for us to think about Afghanistan, if possible, without the ideological lenses of our own national interest or our own religions or our own whatever we have been told, and think of it in humanistic terms. What is happening to people of Afghanistan? What could happen to them because of Taliban? And then how, as fellow human beings, how can we stand in solidarity with them? That's all I'm encouraging, right? Um, and I hope that you will join that. Okay, so I have a question by Spurti. It's not connected to this, but sir, can you explain these things under literary theories? Like, is it possible to apply any theories of food? Yeah, of course. So, for example, if you look at Afghanistan, and you can look at what kind of discourses bring about, let's say you want to see the Indian response, right? You want to read the Indian response in newspapers or in your political statements, right? So then you can go and analyze the discourse that underwrites it. And for India, it is the discourse of democracy, right? So they are reading it according to that. If you want to read the Pakistani response to it, you could read it under the discourse of a national interest, that they are not looking at it from the point of view of Afghan people. They are looking at it from the point of view of what suits their national interests. So their approach is instrumental, right? They see Taliban as an instrument that can deliver the kind of policy gains that they want in Afghanistan. So you can absolutely use theory to read these situations. Um, So, Oracle, the trauma theory, I absolutely find it really amazing, both individual trauma and collective trauma, to study literature. I sadly do not have much of an expertise in it, but I've read works in which people have used trauma theory about the partition, about Kashmir, about Palestine, right? So I absolutely recommend it, that it is a viable way of also studying Afghanistan. Okay, so we'll continue a little more. We have DP Mitra. I couldn't join you from the beginning, but I watch all your videos. All are very nice and not only clear concept, but sometimes show us the right way to understand incidents in the life itself. Thank you. Well, I won't call it the right way because you all get to decide based on your own assumptions and your own moral universe what right and wrong is. But I think what I try to do is place my thought in planetary terms and connect it always to the plight of the powerless, right? One thing, those of you who live in former colonies, there are always foundational intellectuals. These are people who work at prestigious universities, who are sponsored by their governments, right? And then at a certain point in their careers, they lose their own voice, right? Because they become spokespersons for power, right? And maybe there are advantages to that, right? Maybe they have a more comfortable life or whatever. But what I encourage my students is to be public intellectuals, to be activist intellectuals. And that means that you align yourself with disenfranchised communities. You align yourself with communities who are, who are under oppression. And that means that we either lend our words in support, we stand in solidarity with them. So I think, Mitraji, uh, you know, if you look at my work, even my published work, but on videos, I hope one thing that comes through all these is that I'm not a pedantic professor of literature, that I believe in that kind of activist thinking. And I believe that, as humanists, we need to take our place with anyone who is struggling anywhere in the world. Uh, So, yeah, Singhji, I mean, you can call it a Taliban. Taliban for me would be a, someone who doesn't oppress his own people, you know. And so now it's getting to be longer. Sukhdevji, welcome. How would China negotiate volatile situation in Afghanistan different from Russia and USA? Look, I mean, Chinese are very pragmatic, right? And in the end, China's priorities are not similar to United States, India, or others. Like they don't really practically care if there is a democracy or whatever. China's interest in Afghanistan would be the raw materials that Afghanistan has, access to those, and maybe making them part of their beltway or road project. Right? That is China's interest. And maybe since they share a little bit of border with them, to have a stable Afghanistan suits them too. So the Chinese view of Afghanistan cannot be similar to what United States view is it, because the US, at least apparently on the surface, have to build a narrative of supporting democracy. Chinese have no qualms about that. They don't need to sell that narrative. So right now they're selling the narrative of stability. Right? Whenever someone uses, or we want a stable Afghanistan, what they are saying is that the means do not matter. The end justifies the means. That is a consequentialist way of not, that is an instrumentalist way of looking at it, right? Or consequentialist too, in so many ways. So that, I think, is China's response to it, right? Is to extract resources and to have a stable Afghanistan. I mean, Pakistanis are also using the same vocabularies. Spurti, yes, you can use the ideological and repressive state apparatuses also in reading. Any theory that deals with ideology, that deals with discourse, that deals with understanding cultural differences, you can absolutely use it to study what's happening in Afghanistan. You can also use feminism and gender theory to see what is happening to women, right? And why is it important to understand that? So I think, Spurti, I hope I answered your question. I think, yes, absolutely. If I have an article from about 8 years ago, and that was about, I think it was on Taliban. And if you look at that there, I think I had used Giorgio Agamben, right? And his concept of passive and active right holders, right? And I used that to read how a Talibanistic mode of governance and all treats, converts women into these passive right holders, right? So absolutely you can use theory, especially political theory or theory that is political, to absolutely read this situation. So Sukhdev ji, yeah, I mean, Chinese always think in long term, right? They don't think in a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades. I mean, I can give you an anecdote. When I was in Pakistan Army, at that time, a military contingent went to visit to do high level talks in China. And one of the generals on that was my superior. And he shared his experience with me. And he said, when we talked to them and said, help us on Kashmir or help us here, the Chinese would say, why don't you wait? Put this on the back burner. This is keeping you back. Build your economy, right? Come to a point where you don't even have to ask for things, people will give them to you. And then they will give an example. They say, we waited 400 years for Macau, now it's ours. We have waited 100 years for Hong Kong. When it is time, it will be ours. So they have this, what we call the long view of time. So, for them, it's immaterial what kind of government is in Afghanistan, as long as it is stable and as long as it serves their business interest or their commercial interests or their national interests, they will work with them. I'm not saying it's morally right or wrong. It's more pragmatic. Oh, no, I mean, Mavandra ji, I absolutely know about Caliban, not just the Shakespeare's character, but also how Chen Weizu rereads it, right? How I myself have read it, how Césaire rewrites The Tempest. So I'm pretty aware of that debate. But what I'm saying is imagining Taliban to be this rightful owners of Afghanistan because they are not part of the aerialized westernized elite, I think that would be simplistic because that kind of idealizes the Taliban into this Caliban figure who has now ousted the aerialized elite and given Afghanistan back to the people. I think it is more complicated than that. And I don't read Taliban as the original Calibans of Afghanistan. I actually believe more in a sort of borrowing from any culture possible. But I'm also a strong believer in democracy. I believe that representative democracy, imperfect as it is the best we can come up with as human beings to at least create a space where we can constantly keep tweaking the system. So, on one level, any kind of autocratic regime, much less the kind Taliban are imposing, I will never support that. So yeah, thank you so much. So it's been about 1 hour, but thank you so much for joining me here. We do this pretty much every Saturday, not every, but every time I plan these, I make an announcement on our Facebook page, which is Post-Colonial Space, as well as on the community page of the channel. So if you have notifications enabled, you should get a notification whenever I post it there. So Spurti, I think you have my email, right? If you do, if you could remind me about that article, I think I have a digital link to it and I will send it to you. It's probably also linked on my website, but just remind me on my email and then I will make it available to you. Sukhdev ji. Recently, a retired Indian diplomat, Vijay Gokhale, has written a book on China entitled The Long Game as opposed to the Great Game China has been. Yeah, I would love to read that book, but I agree with that view. Yeah, I agree with that view. So, okay, so I guess I'm going to call it a day. We've been going on for 1 hour. As always, send me your questions, your queries, your suggestions. Please pass this on to more people so that more people can benefit from these live sessions, but also from the 600 educational videos that we now have on the channel. I am really grateful to you for your support and for taking the time on a weekend to join me on this not a very exciting conversation. It's an academic conversation. So I will now see you next time, right? Until then, as I always say, my wife laughs at it, right? I mean, she finds it really endearing. As always, peace and love. Okay.